When Zelda, F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda Zaire, broke off her engagement with would-be writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's the writer of The Great Gatsby, you guys might be familiar with, in 1919, she told him that he would have to become a successful, on his own writer. Later, she wrote about how a woman can achieve greatness. This is her words. Rouge means that women want to choose their man, not take what lives in the next house over. Look back over the pages of history and see how the loveliness of women has always stirred men and nations on to great achievement. There have been women who were not pretty, who have swayed hearts and empires, but these women, they did not disdain that thing for which paint and powder stands. They wanted to choose their destinies, to be successful competitors in this great game of life. Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald married 1 week after Scott published his first novel. Zelda continued to be a model for Scott's independent, unconventional, ambitious female characters. He even copied from her letters and other writings into his work. Ironically, Zelda's devotion to her marriage and motherhood stifled her career ambitions. Nevertheless, she became a model for a generation of young American women who wanted to break away from traditions and forget the hardship of the war years. So we started talking about the 20s women yesterday. So I'm going to flip through the very first screen here. We had left off with a conversation about double standards. So here's just a little bit about this screen. By the 1920s, the experiences of World War I, the pull of the cities, and changing attitudes had opened up a new world for many young Americans. These wild young people, wrote John F. Carter Jr. in the 1920 issue of Atlantic Monthly, were experiencing a world unknown to their parents. We have seen men at their lowest and women at their lightest in a terrible moral chaos of Europe. We have been forced to question and in many cases to discard the religion of our fathers. We've been forced to live in an atmosphere of tomorrow we die, and so naturally we drank and we were merry. In the rebellious, pleasure-loving atmosphere of the 20s, many women began to assert their independence, reject the values of the 19th century, and demand the same freedoms as men. The flapper. During the 20s, a new ideal emerged for some women. The flapper was an emancipated young woman who embraced new fashions and urban attitudes of the day. Close-fitting felt hats, bright, waistless dresses, an inch above the knee, silk-toned silk stockings, sleek pumps, a string of beads replaced the dark and prim ankle-length dresses, whalebone corsets, and petticoats of those Victorian days. Young women clipped their long hair into boyish bobs and dyed it jet black. Many young women became more assertive in their bid for equal status with men. Some began smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, talking openly about sex, oh no, actions that would have ruined their reputation not so many years before. They danced things like the foxtrot, the camel walk, the tango, the charleston, the shimmy. Attitudes toward marriage changed as well. Many middle-class men and women began to view marriage more as an equal partnership, although both agreed that housework and child-rearing remained a woman's job. The double standard. Magazine, newspapers, and advertisements promoted the image of a flapper. The young people openly discussed courtship and relationship in ways that scandalized the previous generation. Although many young women donned the new outfits and flouted tradition, the flapper was more of an image of rebellious youth than a widespread reality. It didn't really reflect the attitudes and values of many young people. During the 1920s, morals loosened only so far. Traditionalists in church and school protested the new casual dances and women's acceptance of smoking and drinking. In the years before World War I, the men who courted women pursued only women they intended to marry. But in the 1920s, casual dating became increasingly accepted. Even so, there was a double standard, a set of principles granting greater sexual freedom to men than to women, which remains, of course, required women to observe stricter standards for their own behavior than men did. As a result, many women were pulled back and forth between old standards and new.
Along with and sometimes propelled by the great technological leap in the 1920s, social patterns in place for decades also began to shift. Nowhere was this more obvious than with the changes for American women. An expanding job market had given more and more women careers and the disposable income to do with what they wished. Throughout the 1920s, women would assert a newfound freedom and independence, and nothing symbolized it more than the 19th Amendment. In 1920, after 81 years of agitation, women won the right to vote.
A woman's lot had changed in almost every way. She thought that she had the right to live for herself rather than for her family, for others, as women were always supposed to. She went to bars. She went to after-hours clubs. She went to wild parties. She had much shorter hair. She wore much more makeup. You go from having young women whose dresses reach to their ankles to flesh everywhere. And a lot of 20s culture is about the fun of smashing prohibitions.
The more daring women of the day were known as flappers and vamps.
Sure, I remember flappers. They were all over the place. They were older than me. But, when you look at the flappers through the eyes of a young guy, wow.
I think a flapper was the type of young woman who just wanted to see how far she could go and then would stop because she'd be afraid to go too far. And a vamp didn't care how far she went.
The shattering ways of 1920s city life were spread by the media to rural America. Places where the changes were not always so easy to get used to.
Okay, we're going to talk about changing family and work patterns now. This is Margaret Sanger. She's got a really interesting story. She grew up in a New York tenement. Her mother gave birth like 13 times. It was just back to back to back. And she grew up in this atmosphere where her mom was always in a stage of pregnancy, delivering, pregnant again, delivering. And she watched how her mother's body had been weakened by all of that and knew that the wealthy women in the communities had access to information that allowed them to control that to a degree. She felt like her family stayed in poverty in part because the poor people in a community didn't have access to the same birth control information. And so she began a fight. She would, if you're taking a look at these options here and making your guess, you guys know that from the other day's conversation that she did get arrested 9 times. She was a violator of the Comstock laws, state laws in New York that said it was immoral and indecent to share information about birth control with the public. She did end up founding the Birth Control League, which later would become the very first Planned Parenthood. So when you flash Planned Parenthood on the corners, you can say thank you to Margaret Sanger. She was also a proponent, though, of not only birth control, but sterilization in certain spots. So while she was not necessarily racist, the ability to control and sterilize and control the population did have her at some interesting places. So she did get encouraged and recruited to speak at the KKK rallies and was really well received there because they felt like she had a tool that they could use to further their own platform. Okay, so while not a Klan member, she was invited to speak because of the sterilization options that she could have as tools for them. So all of these are actually true. Okay. So a little bit about new work opportunities, roles at home and work. Although women had worked successfully during the war, afterwards, employers who believed that men had the responsibility to support their families financially often replaced female workers with men. So the progress they made during the war to be encouraged to move into other industries, we're going to see a backlash, and that's not uncommon post-global conflict. Women continued to seek paid employment, but the opportunities changed. Many female college graduates turned to women's professions. They became Elementary school teachers, they became nurses, they became librarians. Big businesses required extensive correspondence and record keeping, creating a huge demand for clerical workers like typists, filing clerks, secretaries, stenographers, and office machine operators. Others became clerks in stores or held jobs on assembly lines. A handful of women broke the old stereotypes by doing work once reserved for men, such as flying airplanes, driving taxis, and drilling oil wells, but that was uncommon and unusual. By 1930, 10 million women were working, earning wages. However, few rose to managerial jobs, and wherever they did work, women earned less than men. And to this day, I think the going rate is around, I think it's up from 76 cents on the dollar to about 82 cents on the dollar as far as women doing the same work as men. Fearing competition for jobs, men argued that women were just temporary workers whose real job was at home. Between 1900 and 1930, the patterns of discrimination and inequality for women in the business world was established. In the 1920s, widespread social and economic changes reshaped the family. The birth rate had been declining for several decades, and it dropped at a slightly faster rate in the 1920s. This decline was in part due to wider availability of birth control information. Margaret Sanger, who you see to your left, had first opened the very first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916, founded by the American Birth Control League in 1921, and fought for the legal rights of physicians to give birth control information to their patients. At the same time, social, technological innovations simplified household labor and family life. Stores overflowed with ready-made clothes, with sliced bread, and with canned foods, all things that had taken women hours or days to produce before. Public agencies provided services for the elderly, public health clinics served the sick, and workers' compensation assisted those who could no longer work. These innovations and institutions had the effect of freeing homemakers from some of their traditional family responsibilities, and many middle-class housewives, the main shoppers and the money managers, focused their attention on their homes, their husbands, children's, and pastimes. I consider time for reading clubs and my children more important than careful housework. I just don't do it, said one Indiana woman in the 1920s. As the spheres of activity and influence expanded, women experienced greater equality in marriage. Marriages became based sometimes upon romantic love and companionship as opposed to the categories that were used before. Children no longer were thrown together with adults in factory work, farm labor, and apprenticeships, and spent most of their days at school and in organized activities with others their own age. At the same time, parents began to rely more heavily on manuals of child care and the advice of experts. Working class and college educated women quickly discovered the pressure of juggling work and family, but the strain on working class women was more severe. Helen Wright, who worked for the Women's Bureau in Chicago, recorded the struggle of one Irish mother of two, and perhaps if you pay attention to your mother, you can relate to this. She worked in one of the meatpacking companies, pasting labels from 7 a.m. to 3:30. She'd entered the eldest child at school, but sent her others to nursery for lunch and after school. The youngest was in nursery all day. She kept her house immaculately clean and perfect order, but to do so, she worked until 11 o'clock most nights during the week, and on Saturday night, she worked until 5. She described her schedule as follows. On Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, she cleaned one room a night. Saturday afternoon, she finished the cleaning and put the house in order. And Saturday night, she washed. Sunday, she baked. And Monday, she ironed. And all of that while going to work and taking care of the children. So as women adjusted to changing rules, some also struggled with rebellious adolescents who put an unprecedented strain on families. Teens in the 1920s studied and socialized with other teens. It's actually kind of the beginning of this idea of you guys being teenagers. They spent less time with their families, and as peer pressure intensified, some adolescents resisted parental control, much as flappers resisted societal control. The theme of adolescent rebelliousness can be seen in much of the popular culture of the 1920s. Education and entertainment reflected the conflict between traditional attitudes and modern ways of thinking. Okay. Could you please think about how women's lives changed socially, politically, and economically during the 1920s, which would have been the focus of that particular section? Thank you very much.